I never would have expected a little indie game like Iconoclasts to become a newly minted favorite of all time, but here we are. First enchanted by the aesthetic of its launch trailer, I quickly found myself captivated not just by its puzzling dungeons and challenging boss fights, but the compelling characters and complex conflicts they had become embroiled in. I could likely talk about this game for hours, but for the sake of your time and my own, I'll keep it simple. Within this video, I'll not only go over the game's basic design, but I'll provide an overview as to how the pacing, writing, and mechanics are merged together to maintain a coherent, consistent emotional experience. In other words, I intend to demonstrate how gameplay and narrative are not at odds with each other. By the conclusion, I hope developers and other game design enthusiasts can see how much Iconoclasts has to offer. There are going to be spoilers shown and discussed, so if the game is already on your backlog, I highly recommend you save this video for after you've played it. Naturally, I'd like to encourage anyone watching play the game, but I understand some may need further convincing than others. With that out of the way, let's get to talking gameplay. While I'd say narrative is Iconoclast's greatest strength, developer Joakim Sandberg reveals equal care and passion for the game's mechanical design. The blending of narrative and gameplay starts with our very protagonist, Robin the amateur engineer. Rather than create a plethora of unique tools for specific tasks, Robin relies upon her wonderfully versatile wrench. From melee combat to cranking doors open, the trusty tool is up to nearly any task she comes across. Sure, real engineering is a lot more complex than twisting some bolts, but through the magic of game design, Sandberg abstracted an entire profession into easy to understand play mechanics. Let's take a gander at Mark Brown's video on versatile verbs to better understand why this was a good move. In that Game Maker's Toolkit video, Mark Brown emphasizes the external context of a button press, how it is pressed and in conjunction with what other buttons. What happens if you press A and B together, or if you hold the A button rather than tap it? If the player taps the wrench button, Robin swings it a single time like a club. If the player holds the button, she whirls the wrench like a baton. This is the external context that Mark largely covers. Iconoclasts also focuses on what I'd like to call the internal context of a button press, how the current situation in-game modifies the behavior of the character or tools. If you swing or whirl the wrench while standing beside a bolt, you latch on and are able to crank it. This can open doors, power generators, or spin the thing. Whirl the wrench while jumping near a bolt and Robin latches and hangs on. Combine internal and external context by whirling the wrench while leaping towards the bolt and Robin swings to extend her jump. Even though these are all abstractions of the wrench as a tool, they simultaneously follow a real-world logic, latching a wrench onto a bolt and twisting it, and follow similar behaviors with a minimal number of symbols. Wrench plus bolt equals twist, and so it stands to reason that, say, latching onto a bolt mid-leap twists Robin and sends her further. This focus on consistent behavior with in-game symbols becomes intuition, so when the player sees a bolt on a chain for the first time in the late game, they immediately know to jump and latch onto it. The slow descent of the chain is a new outcome, but the player instinctively knew what they were supposed to do. How about the electrical charge the player gets in the icy pirate base? Closer to abstract than reality, but all that changes is the outcome to a familiar move. The same tricks the player has already learned and mastered are simply given new and more varied contexts. Whirling the wrench now gains an electric charge. Latch onto a bolt attached to a rail and the player slowly glides along, or rushes through at high speed if Robin's got a full electrical charge. Reality continues to be abstracted by Robin now acting as an electric charge herself, being able to pass that charge to certain objects. No new actions, just new results. In Bastion Tower, this ability itself gets an upgrade that passes an electric charge to her only other tool, the stun gun. If Robin's wrench is significant to her identity as an engineer, then what does the stun gun say about her? Well, for starters, that she isn't a soldier or murderer, of other humans at least. Animal rights activists may take some umbrage with her merciless slaughter of local wildlife on the other hand. Nevertheless, the stun gun also has two verbs based on external context. Tap the gun button to shoot a single bullet, or release a more powerful blast by holding and then releasing the button. While the stun gun can blast away some obstructions, it's largely limited to combat until you obtain the grenade and missile enhancements. These can destroy more obstacles and even move platforms. Once Robin gains that electric modification in Bastion Tower, she is also capable of sending an electrical charge through those grenades or missiles, opening up more puzzling possibilities. The simplicity in which these tasks can be completed should be the big takeaway here. A wide variety of results are tied logically to a limited number of buttons and actions. You have the jump button, the gun button, and the wrench button. Learning the controls is easy, and by limiting the number of symbols that must be memorized, the player spends more time intuitively experimenting and finding quick success in the outcome. The player masters the limited moveset quickly, spends more time feeling clever for swiftly recognizing a puzzle solution. Of course, that's assuming all of these mechanics are combined in an engaging enough fashion. A lot of people have referred to Iconoclasts as a Metroidvania, and creator Sandberg himself has cited Metroid Fusion and Monster World 4 as major inspirations to his design. However, I'm not sure either of these games quite capture the experience of playing Iconoclasts. For me, the most immediate comparison that comes to mind is actually The Legend of Zelda. Think of each of Iconoclast's zones as a dungeon rather than a level or sector. Like a Zelda game, the player must solve a number of puzzles to progress to the end. There's exploration and non-linear traversal of an environment, but Metroid games never really had puzzles like this. They were always more about finding the correct route. Even when Robin gains a new upgrade, it's more like finding the key item in a temple or dungeon in Zelda. From the start, each zone seems to introduce, explore, and build upon new gameplay elements. The introductory realm of Blackrock is the basic tutorial section, latching training wheels onto the basics of what Robin's arsenal can do. The Shard Wastelands removes the training wheels and brings in cogs that move and shift platforms. This is also where Robin obtains her first upgrade, the grenade and missile combo to her stun gun. The player is given a chance to explore the grenade's versatility before being tossed into a boss fight requiring its use. Let's digress into these bosses a bit. Most of the game's dungeons consist of multiple higher tier foes designed specifically to put Robin's new gear to the test, to force her to work in tandem with AI companions, or allow for some new combination of old abilities. Let's go back to that boss in Shard Wastelands. In order to defeat it, the player has to push it back into the targeting range of Robin's companion, Royal. This emphasizes the knockback trait of the grenade, later implemented in a fight with the Master Controller further in the game. In case the player has forgotten about this trait, a one-concerned soldier tosses several grenades to demonstrate this very response. Even when that encounter shifts from a vertical ascent to a horizontal escape, the very nature of the encounter is transformed. Instead of manipulating the placement of a foe, the player is holding their enemy at bay while also dodging dangerous obstacles. It's the same mechanic, but the context and response changes the tension and challenge. The same can be said for the different instances Robin uses her wrench against these giant mechanical foes. We even see the rails used against the Carver in both an evasive and offensive manner. Bosses are treated the same as puzzles, albeit more lethally. This is some straight up Nintendo style design. No matter how far the player is into the game, make sure they're encountering something new and different without overcomplicating the mechanics. Explore the myriad possibilities of just a few abilities rather than rely on a multitude. Where Iconoclast deviates, however, is the length and complexity of these dungeons over a period of time. Bastion Tower, smack dab in the middle of the game, is what I'd consider peak dungeon. By that I mean there's very little combat to be found, instead focusing on the tower itself as one massive puzzle. Robin has to weave between two separate elevators, zigzagging between floors, and unlocking doors and passageways to slowly get all of her gear back. There are some obstacles and mini boss fights, but otherwise Bastion is a long, pensive puzzle, which is why the dungeons that follow are so interesting. New complications, mechanics, and puzzle combinations are still introduced, but none of them are quite as complex or long as Bastion Tower, a decision that proves to benefit the game's tone. So what does a term like pacing even mean? When it comes to a video game, it can mean a lot. On a basic level, it can refer to the rate at which new abilities are given to the player. You want to be careful that you don't throw too many new things at the player at once, as this runs the risk of overwhelming the player's memory. As I mentioned earlier, you want these abilities to become instinct and intuition. Unfortunately, if you take too long to train the player on these new abilities, you risk a series of puzzles being too simple or too repetitive. Based on the prior two sections, we already know Iconoclast provides new challenges and abilities to the player, with each dungeon focusing on one or two new mechanics or traits. This keeps the gameplay at a steady incline, doing its best to avoid outpacing the player's own skill or capability. Does this really prevent monotony though? Is it enough to simply swap between puzzles and combat? This is where minigames like box sorting in the Shard Wastelands comes into play. The player is given something new to focus on that's a bit more intense than a puzzle, what with the explosive contents and all, but not as intense as combat. Similarly as the off-maligned stealth fight, commonly criticized because its unique hiding mechanics are never used again. Just as the box sorting puzzle, this encounter acts as a middle ground between low-intensity puzzles and high-intensity combat. Most reviews refer to this as variety, but such a term overlooks how this type of gameplay breaks up monotony. What is more important is the management of intensity. A game like Iconoclasts juggles exciting, fast-paced boss fights and ponderous, brain-bending puzzles. Too much of one is bound to exhaust or bore players that prefers the other. Now, I mentioned that Bastion Tower is peak dungeon on Iconoclasts due to being the most puzzle intensive. It is the longest and most complex dungeon in the game. The amount of time from one major plot-pushing cutscene to the next is going to be a decently long time, long enough to risk the player becoming emotionally disconnected from the story. This is where narrative pacing in games tend to struggle. Iconoclast itself wrestles a bit, as the whole reason you're in Bastion Tower is to rescue Samba, Mina's girlfriend captured by Agent Black. Despite Mina's constant reminders as to why you're adventuring together, the plot is still distracted by saving a child of Blackrock, reuniting with Elro, progressing through Shockwood, fighting the Carver, getting captured, and having to retrieve your equipment. By the time you reach Samba, it's tough to feel like she's in trouble, which to the game's credit, Samba doesn't seem all too frightened either. Bastion Tower being peak dungeon is advantageous to the narrative because it reduces the odds of the player becoming distracted after. Samba may not be frightened, but tensions begin to rise at the tower top nonetheless as Black begins to enact her revenge upon Elro. This escalation persists as the game progresses, and as a result, the dungeons begin to move faster without sacrificing challenge of combat or puzzle. No single dungeon is as complicated as Bastion Tower, and City 1 itself is the most simple and short in regards to puzzles and combat. Whereas most games feel like huge slogs through a final dungeon to reach their conclusion, Iconoclast feels much more in line with binge-watching the end of a television season or series. Each character gets their moment, and several high-intensity boss fights are followed by a pregnant, nervous calm for the player to reflect. It's more than just increasing the rate of narrative progress, it's the manner in which the game's narrative is divided into smaller moments throughout each dungeon. Before Bastion Tower, it's largely limited to setting the stage, introducing characters, preparing the player for the later revelations they'll experience. Going back to Bastion Tower, we can see examples in Robin's witness of a student's punishment, or overhearing a conversation between Mina and Elro. The game isn't halted for the sake of story, but information is communicated nonetheless. One of the best examples may in fact be after Robin gains her new modification to the electric charge at the tower's bottom. Without stopping the action, the player is witness to Tolo and the rest of General Chrome's soldiers sneaking into Bastion. Immediately, the player is intuitively driven to question why Chrome soldiers are sneaking in, what it could mean, and what's to come. Using the environment to foreshadow and prepare the player for future events is another useful pacing tool. Introduce, say, upcoming bosses. Seeing the Carver tearing through the background of Shockwood Forest before coming face to face with it, or the Silver Watchman sneaking through Bastion Tower observing Robin. Or in some ways, even the quaking of the world, hinting to the shifting of the spines and the planet's imminent demise. Of course, these are more than just tools to pace out the narrative and mentally prepare the player for upcoming conflict. They're the most superficial use of the environment to communicate meaning to the player. MISE-EN-SCENE, which I'm probably pronouncing wrong, roughly translates to placing on stage. The Merriam-Webster definition of MISE-EN-SCENE is the arrangement of actors and scenery on stage for a theatrical production. However, in cinema, it has come to mean how all visual elements are arranged before the camera. Even what seems to be inconsequential elements of the background have likely been placed intentionally. A physical line or barrier within a scene can be a physical manifestation of the emotional or ideological barriers between two characters, for example. I think MISE-EN-SCENE applies to video games as well, though interpreted in two separate ways. Way back at the start of this channel, I made a video called Silent Tutorials, highlighting how games like Dishonored will use the environment to communicate gameplay concepts without outright telling the player what to do. This is a purely mechanical use of the concept, but what many have dubbed environmental storytelling is also a variant of MISE-EN-SCENE. Rewind back to my Metroid Other M video, where I made note of the significance of the dead space pirates trapped behind a locked door in Metroid Prime. That's MISE-EN-SCENE. BioShock just straight up smacks you in the face with it as soon as you enter the lighthouse. Of course, this face smacking is to increase the odds of the player even noticing it at all. Unlike a film, a game's director doesn't always control the camera. The player usually controls the camera, which means it is more than possible that they could miss many of these details. After all, if such visual elements are consciously overlooked in film, then imagine how easy it is to ignore it in gameplay. This is where Iconoclast's side-scrolling nature is at an advantage. There is only one angle from which the player can observe the environment, which allows each level and dungeon to contain a series of little details that are easier to catch. You just need to stop and smell the flowers, so to speak. First-time players will likely forget or pay no mind to the feathers beneath these spines, and, in fact, the feathers sculpted into the spines themselves, but right at the start we have our first major clue into the game's final boss. It is also our first indication of the care and detail developer Sandberg has put into the game's world. At first, the angular plant life of Iconoclast's world seems like an aesthetic choice, but in actuality it is ivory, the lifeblood and power source of the planet, that generates angular, artificial-looking vegetation. We can see some of this evidence in Blackrock's background, but it becomes even more apparent as we see pyramid and cube-shaped objects beneath the terrain of the Shard Wastelands. It is never stated, but I believe the angular nature of the planet's leaves is why the triangle is so prominent in the One Concern's religious imagery. City 1, the One Concern capital and home of religious leader Mother, is itself surrounded by a triangle. There are triangles in the windows of the settlement homes. We can see triangle patterns in the hair of Mother's portrait, as well as her hands forming the shape of a triangle. The One Concern soldiers have triangles on their hats. Mother's two guards, referred to as Mother's Corners, have pyramid-shaped hats, or masks. Together with Mother, they form 3 points similar to a triangle. It should be noted that, in this room, there are also 3 locks prohibiting the player from reaching the top of Bastion Tower. The very entrance to City 1 is covered in such imagery, including 3 women carved into the architecture. Even the wine stacks in Father's chambers are triangles. Clearly the triangle and its 3 points are important to One Concern. So why do I think the triangle is derived from the angular shape of the world's leaves? Largely because the rounded leaf, a leaf as we know it, is a prominent symbol in the adversarial faith of the Icy Pirates. It's not the only symbol, but just as those following One Concern swear by the Tri, you could find Icy Pirates speaking of the rounded leaf. This symbol is a bit more abstract as it also combines with imagery of human bones, creating a link between human life and nature. I have to jump ahead of myself here and discuss some theories about the game's setting. Iconoclast relies on the player to infer a lot by piecing together details in both the environment and spoken dialogue. Mina speaks of the ancestral vessel, which looks to be a crashed ship. The texts and scripture on board emphasize procreation and continued existence of the species, coupled with organic seeds having been on board. We can see the importance of this procreation prerogative in the pirate base's hideout, with couples in embrace and statues dedicated to couples holding a baby. In the game's latter half, we discover that the One Concern also possess an ancestral vessel, dismantled and torn apart from efforts to salvage and reverse engineer it. We can intuit that it was from this old technology that the One Concern learned how to build a rocket. When you first encounter Royal, he mentions being unable to create flowers as they are drawn in City 1's ancient texts. In Mother's Tower, we can see a poster of the Statue of Liberty in New York City in the background. We can also make out what looks to be a photo of Earth in the background of Father's chamber. The game never says it outright, but it's pretty obvious that the humans on this world are from a botched mission to colonize and perhaps terraform other planets. The prerogative to continue reproducing suggests that Earth, the old world, is gone and thus the survival of humanity is in jeopardy. The reason I believe the triangle is the symbol of the planet's nature, its leaves, is because it acts in contrast to that of the Icy Pirates. The One Concern rely on ivory, a product of the planet the terraformers landed on, as opposed to the seeds carried from home. What we discover throughout the story is that the seeds wreck ivory-based technology, including the bodies of those whose blood is fused with ivory. To better understand the significance of this opposition, we must look at the characters driving the game's conflict. What drives the characters to war with each other so violently? What brings those bearing the same banner to blows with one another? To put it simply, it's each person's desire to fulfill something meaningful that creates contest, the desire for purpose. Some are already certain of their destiny, such as Captain Myron and General Chrome. When we first meet Chrome, he is in a discussion with an icy pirate regarding ancient texts called the Proceeds. It is in these texts that General Chrome believes to have found his purpose, to unite all disparate ideas and cultures under one banner. His devotion to the one concerned faith and his own personal conceit embolden him into believing he is, in fact, chosen by him, the star worm that is the one concerned's god. This very conceit is ultimately his undoing, deluded into thinking himself invulnerable until Elro's little cocktail causes him to combust. Elro is a character driven by a completely reactionary goal. After the one concerned killed he and Robin's father, he had begun a selfish journey towards revenge without regard for consequences. It is his agent-killing vaccine that kicks off most of the game's events, sending Agent Black on a warpath and bringing the one concerned's penance down upon his family. Never do these consequences force Elro to reconsider his actions or methods. He instead tries to force Robin, his only remaining family, to stay out of danger while diving face first into his quest for retribution. Agent Black, in the meantime, just lost the one person that could give her a greater sense of purpose than mere duty. Forced to latch onto the slightest possible reason to live after a lifetime of rejection and loss, she is adamant in keeping the status quo going not out of piety, but because she has nothing else left. A goal that General Chrome begins to interfere with. Thus starts the snowball, each character chasing their own goals and desires, crisscrossing paths with one another, escalating the scale of the conflict and begrudging others for getting in their way. A series of myopic people incapable of seeing how their actions impact others, only how others impact their personal goals. Just as both religions have more than a few similarities, we also begin to see that the characters themselves have more in common than they recognize or would ever admit. Mina clearly has a distaste for both Elro and Royal, despite having more than a few things in common. Just like Elro, Mina has a stubborn sense of following her own desires regardless of what others say. She also poorly fits into the confines of her own faith, but unlike Elro, who constantly jabs back at the icy religion during critiques of the one concern, she's actually relatively devout. This devotion is not enough to suppress her hunger for freedom and adventure, much in the same way as Royal. Both characters are immature in their own way, with Royal driven by a naive and spoiled pretense of his divinity, while Mina spends more time running away from uncomfortable truths. Constantly, the different characters are juxtaposed against one another, revealing not only their differences, but also their similarities. Each character is given depth and thus made sympathetic. They all want something universal, to know that their life has a meaning, and to see that meaning fulfilled. While players will likely vary in who they are more forgiving of, this depth and care treated to the game's cast is perhaps why it is so compelling. Everyone has a character to favor, and no one side is given preferential treatment. What does it all mean, though? What does it all mean when even the final antagonist is understandably angry about how carelessly its fuel source has been consumed? Let's take a look at one special juxtaposition to see if we can wrangle some meaning out of this game. So we understand that human beings are the result of colony ships landing upon the planet. They divided into what would become the one concerned religion, using the planet's seemingly natural ivory resource to rebuild, while the icy pirates emphasize a preference for the seeds upon the colony ship. We could see how each side mirrors the other, with the angular forms of nature contrasted with the round leaves of the icy seeds. We could see these mirrors even in the iconography, with the mother acting as the icon for the one concern, and depictions of flower and family as the icons for the icy. One concern emphasizes doing your part for the glory of him or mother, for elevated individuals, while the icy emphasize the survival of the whole. On the surface, the icy seem to be the enlightened good guys, but once Mina has killed her first agent, the others coldly celebrate. They immediately begin to dehumanize the agent, going so far as to refer to him as a demon. Survival of humanity is key as long as they follow our ideology, they seem to say. Royal speaks similarly to Robin following the death of Agent Black, referring to her as a horrible woman, as if that makes the violence okay. Let's also take into account how the one concern assigns people to a career, demanding they fulfill their divine duty as demanded by their deity. Those who commit the heresy of unassigned work suffer the potentially fatal penance. It would seem that the icy pirates are once again far more kind to their own citizens, but we later discover that ability to breed defines your value. Because the good Dr. Gustavo was born with a genetic disease that would be passed on to any offspring, he is effectively shunned by the icy pirates. They may not kill the man, but they are still punishing someone for being unable to fulfill the purpose society has demanded. Despite their differences, both the one concern and the icy religion are flawed communities. It is no wonder that all of the characters within those systems are, in some fashion, unhappy with life. In their search for satisfaction, they each become a monster in someone else's eyes. Then there's Robin. I feel as if Robin is the best of both worlds. She chooses her profession, but all of her abilities and talents are restricted to her calling as an engineer. She spins some gears and cranks some bolts to carve a path forward. Rather than immediately disrespect someone else upon meeting them, such as Mina constantly taking jabs at Elro and the One Concern, or any of the One Concern instantly dismissing Royal upon sight, Robin speaks, as much as a silent protagonist can, as an equal. She's not insulting, nor is she demanding, which isn't to say she gets along with everyone. Agent Black develops a serious hate-on for Robin by the game's conclusion. Mina frequently disagrees with Robin's decisions regarding Royal. Elro is constantly frustrated with Robin's decisions to do anything but go home. I think we can better understand what makes Robin special by again looking at General Chrome. Before his demise, Chrome has a peaceful chat with Robin atop Mother's Tower in City 1. He is respectful to her and largely seems to speak to her as an equal, but he also ends up dictating to her what she should do. He's not having a conversation. He's not tossing ideas back and forth. He's telling her what her choice will be as he sees fit. This is a man that, by his own people, goes unchallenged. He is even revered by Tolo, his second in command. But Robin is constantly challenged and frequently told no. Despite this, Robin insists on helping others accomplish their own goals, or trusting them to help her achieve personal or shared goals. In this way, she manages to unite several people under her own banner. So what does Robin choose to do by the game's end? She takes the seeds of the Icy, plunges them into the ivory blood of the One Concern, and builds a whole new world. We'd seen it foreshadowed in conflicts as early as the death of Agent White, and seen how drastic a transformation it can generate in Agent Black. We might have only perceived the destructive power of seeds and ivory mixing, but within that destruction comes nature. Robin manages to save this dying world by combining both revered products of life together, using the planet as a vessel, destroying the old ways. The game is called Iconoclasts for a reason, and giving birth to a whole new world. Respect, selflessness, and confidence are all attributes that Robin exhibited, and they are all what helped her save the day in the end. As a pessimist when it comes to human nature, I appreciate how the game's ending implies that such unity is bound to be short-lived. Either history will repeat or all new grievances and desperate desire for meaning will give rise to new conflict. That doesn't make Robin's journey any less meaningful. She showed that there was another way, a more respectful, kind way. A way that I can truly appreciate. In an interview with YouTube channel OnDoubt, Joakim Sandberg stated that he wanted to make a story that encouraged people to think, but didn't subliminally bash them over the head with messages or ideas. It's one of the reasons I absolutely love this game, as it has given me plenty of ideas to chew and reflect on. It also makes me a bit apprehensive of offering up my own interpretation above of Robin as a unifier. It's possible my own personal worldview is projecting onto the game rather than interpreting it. It's also why I didn't go nearly as deep into characters and themes as I'd love to. Perhaps there will be a time where I'll revisit this game, zooming closer to specific elements rather than the broad strokes. I have a lot of theories about the story and its characters, but they're precisely that, theories. Which means Joakim Sandberg succeeded in creating a game that makes me think not just when solving puzzles, but when contemplating its narrative. I recognize that not everyone will love Iconoclasts as much as I do, but the goal of this video wasn't to make you believe it's one of the objectively best games of all time. What I'm hoping to shine a light on are all the ways mechanics and narrative intertwine rather than stand apart, bucking trends and having a more natural flow, for lack of a better word. As long as you can look at this game's design and appreciate it more than you might have before, I consider that a success. Regardless of how much you love or dislike it, Iconoclasts is a game that should be remembered, not just played, cast aside, and forgotten. Thank you for watching. If you're new to the channel, please feel free to check out some of my other, preferably more recent, videos, subscribe, and for new and old viewers alike, please share. Not even for my sake, but for the sake of Iconoclasts. I love this game and really want more people to play it. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you again.